Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and today I'm continuing with part 21 of my book, Cede 2.0, regarding the First Nation Land Management Act regime. A little discussion on some of the current INM, that's Idle No More, website statements describing INM is warranted. I do not comment on the personal impacts of Idle No More, especially for many for whom this may have been the first of their connecting and getting concerned about issues or having an outlet to express themselves on all that. Certainly, there are many important issues and statements, and Indigenous nations contribute and look for help widely. The INM website republishes a lot of announcements of events, so simply because something is on there does not mean that those the information pertains to can be construed as speaking and seeing themselves in the same way that the INM website suggests of itself. Quote, Idle No More calls on all people to join in a peaceful revolution to honor Indigenous sovereignty, end of quote. This says, to be blunt, screw treaty. I doubt that was the intention, but as such it does not honor Indigenous sovereignty. You cannot honor Indigenous sovereignty without honoring the treaties. To call for revolution, whether as an oxymoron or otherwise, is to disrespect the treaties, since they commit to allegiance to the Crown. Is this a call to Josiah Warren's individualistic anarchy? The, quote, First Nation anarchist or nihilist 1798 to 1874, published a 4-page weekly in 1833 called The Peaceful Revolutionist. Quote, Warren wrote that our united interests were directly at war with the individualities of persons and circumstances and the instinct of self-preservation. He concluded that society must be so converted as to preserve the sovereignty of every individual inviolate, and it must avoid all combinations and connections of persons and interests, and all other arrangements which will not leave every individual at times at liberty to dispose of his or her person and time and property in any manner in which his or her feelings or judgment may dictate, without involving the persons or interests of others. Individual sovereignty is nothing like Indigenous sovereignty. Is this Chavez style, said by some analysts to have been the aim of imposing a peaceful revolution against the middle-class business and labor interests? Is this a warning of violence next, as in John F. Kennedy's "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable"? Is this about relating to Germany's 1989/90 peaceful revolution? There are numerous examples in history, a non-violent or peaceful revolution being a revolution using mostly campaigns of civil resistance, including various forms of non-violent protest, to bring about the departure of governments seen as entrenched and authoritarian. A desire to remove Stephen Harper as Prime Minister and his Conservative Party form majority rule, which has dominated the INM discourse, has nothing to do with Indigenous nations and Crown relations. That's simply Canadian domestic federal politics. It is impossible to say that honoring Indigenous sovereignty is achieved by engaging in Canadian domestic politics, especially when the rhetoric is inconsistent with Indigenous nations' sovereignty and supports the contention that only Aboriginal groups and domestic ethnic minorities exist. Or is this just another sexy term, peaceful revolution, some university student came across somewhere and threw into the mix? I did not find the answer delving deeper into the INM website description. Quote, the vision. INM has and will continue to help build sovereignty. You have sovereignty or you don't. If you're trying to, quote, help build it, you do not have it. Quote, the manifesto. The treaties are nation-to-nation agreements between First Nations and the British Crown, who are sovereign nations. The treaties are agreements that cannot be altered or broken by one side of the two nations. Currently, this government is trying to pass many laws so that reserve lands can also be bought and sold by big companies to get profits from resources. This is an attempt to take away sovereignty and the inherent right to land and resources from First Nations peoples, end of quote. The word, quote, manifesto, end of quote, derives from the Italian word manifesto from the Latin manifestum, meaning clear. There's nothing clear about the INM website manifesto. Josiah Warren had a manifesto too. There is no such party, quote, First Nations, end of quote, to any treaty. Read them. First Nations are mere creatures of federal law, and there was none created at the time of treaty, nor could they have been created at that time, since at time of treaty, Indigenous nations granted permissions to the Crown. Indigenous nations did not ask to be reborn first, and as said, that was constitutionally impossible to do. First Nations, for the reasons I've outlined above, are most definitely not sovereign nations. There is more than one party Indigenous nation to treaties. There are a number of Indigenous nations, and there are a number of treaties. The federal legislation that I presume the authors are referencing, quote, so that reserve lands can also be bought and sold by big companies to get profit from resources, end of quote, are, as explained herein, opt-in. It is incorrect to say that they are, quote, an attempt to take away sovereignty, end of quote. The Crown cannot take it, but Indigenous nations can abandon their very selves and sovereignty and walk away from it. Dangling carrots tempt, not take. I am not even going to bother fully explaining the disturbing use of the term, quote, First Nations peoples, end of quote. Remember, once that new mere creature of law is in existence, quote, we cannot view the members except as an artificial aggregate, end of quote. The noun peoples refers to the human beings of a particular nation or community or ethnic group, and as such, can never include any reference to First Nations, which are defined terms in federal legislation. Quote, the story. Idle No More has quickly become one of the largest Indigenous mass movements in Canadian history. What began as a series of teach-ins through Saskatchewan to protest impending parliamentary bills has now changed the social and political landscape of Canada. In a few short months, Idle No More has become the center of media attention, drawing millions of people to our websites, Twitter account, and Facebook pages every day. Idle No More seeks to assert Indigenous inherent rights to sovereignty and reinstitute traditional laws and nation-to-nation treaties by protecting the lands and waters from corporate destruction, end of quote. The opening says INM was acting as any Canadian might, upset with pending Canadian legislation, in this case pointing out an ethnic minority variable. With respect, someone will have to be specific and offer some example to illustrate just how INM, quote, changed the social and political landscape of Canada, end of quote. The same parties are in power in governments, and I am not aware of any changes to any of the laws INM complained of as the result of protesting those laws. Quote, social, end of quote, might be an easier category to detail. It is really hard to know what the INM website people are trying to say here, because this bit about trying to reinstitute treaties by protecting land, etc., from corporations just makes no sense. Treaties can never be impacted by corporations, being mere creatures of law, and the term reinstitute just has no place in the discussion of treaties. INM, appearing as a lobby group, quote, seeks to assert Indigenous inherent rights to sovereignty, end of quote. Well, I guess that fits with revolution, as in being some sort of revolutionary group trying to take over something. But that has nothing whatsoever to do with Indigenous nations and what they are and have. You cannot somehow mishmash this stuff together and hope it somehow all works, because this does not. Maybe this is some sort of effort by the INM website people to appeal to a broader donation market or gather diverse supporters by using all of the words they all use. Whatever that is not clear. When INM tried to step into matters of Indigenous nations, the result were seriously flawed. The INM website statements, again, I'm not referring to the publication of announcements of events and issues, show a political lobby group, and what it may be teaching or advocating is worrisome, unless you are mere creatures of law, domestic ethnic minorities, or an Aboriginal group. There's a reason not everyone carries the original laws and stories. There is great care taken to ensure the accurate transmission of knowledge in Indigenous nations. A final caution regarding the INM website. Look at a definition of revolution. Quote, an overthrow or repudiation and the thorough replacement of an established government or political system by the people governed. 2. Sociology, a radical and pervasive change in society and the social structure, especially one made suddenly and often accompanied by violence. Combine that with the calls to direct action, quote, use any tactics possible, end of quote, and well, watch out, INM website administrators. Bill C-51 is coming your way. It passed third reading in the House of Commons on May 6, 2015. I have pointed out some issues regarding Bill C-51 in social media and do not intend an analysis here. Simply as background, mostly for readers who are not in Canada, and so many may not be familiar with Bill C-51, and not to be construed as my endorsement of anything written, here is one very brief description. Quote, the scope of the Conservative government's anti-terror legislation is broad, and it may be difficult to hear what the real issues and concerns are amid the noise and clatter of Ottawa. So as best we can, Yahoo Canada News presents an anti-terror Bill 101, or as we'd like to call it, Bill C-51 for Dummies. What is Bill C-51? Bill C-51 was introduced at the end of January 2015 and sets out to extend Canada's anti-terror laws beyond legislation the then Liberal government implemented just after 9/11. The bill comes at a time when tension over threats of terrorism on home soil are high. Attacks on 2 Canadian soldiers in October 2014, as well as the attack on the Charlie Hebdo office in Paris, are often cited by members of the government as justification for tougher laws. Bill C-51, according to Public Safety Minister Steve Blaney, is in line with the government's firm commitment to protect Canadians from jihadist terrorists who seek to destroy the values Canadians hold dear. The bill, though, is not just about terrorism. It's about granting greater powers to police authorities to target activities that could undermine the security of Canada, as well as activities that are detrimental to Canada's interests. If and when implemented, Bill C-51 would mean broad and significant changes to national security measures. Its main provisions would facilitate information sharing among 17, and some say more than 17, federal institutions, give police powers that would allow them to preventively detain or restrict terror suspects, ban the promotion of terrorism, allow the public safety minister to add people to Canada's no-fly list, and enhance the powers of Canada's spy agency CSIS. And the provisions have received widespread criticism. That's by Laura Bellew-Stubing, Bill C-51 for Dummies, What You Should Know, Explaining the Tories' Controversial Anti-Terror Legislation, Canada Politics, March 12, 2015. Well, of course, this bill was, in fact, passed and is implemented, and we do now have this anti-terrorism law in effect in Canada. Indigenous nations engaged in proper and lawful diplomacy with the Crown have nothing to worry about Bill C-51 so long as Indigenous nationals take due care about their other associations. But no one ever said diplomacy was easy. Plus, it never ends. There is no final solution, and it often gets more complicated for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow. I take no issue with the description of Idle No More by its fiscal sponsor, the Polaris Institute. Quote, Idle No More, INM, is a grassroots Indigenous social movement that calls on all people to honor Indigenous sovereignty and to protect the land and water. INM pressures government and industry to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples and to protect the environment. The Polaris Institute acts as the fiscal sponsor to INM. That's by the Polaris Institute. To make an online donation in support of the Idle No More movement, please complete the fields below and make your donation by credit card or PayPal. Please note that all donations will be processed through Idle No More's fiscal sponsor, the Polaris Institute. This is on the INM website. But the fact remains that INM is acting for Polaris Institute, its fiscal sponsor, quote, whatever fiscal agent or sponsorship has evolved to mean in practice, both in the U.S. and here, Canada, the fundamental legal requirement is clear. A charity explicitly instructs another organization to carry out some of the charity's work, consistent with the charity's charitable purposes. There is a Creole proverb attributed as originating in Martinique that says, "He who takes a partner takes a master." Everyone understands how hard it is to obtain donations and funding to do what they want to do, but the legal fact remains. INM, bracket the website, close bracket, does not carry out work for Indigenous nations. It carries out work for the Polaris Institute. Quote, the Polaris Institute is a registered nonprofit organization in Canada based in Ottawa and has 501c3 charitable status in the United States, end of quote. Its United States office in a house at 2235 Lakeshore Road, Essex, New York, USA. Essex is a town in Essex County, New York, United States, overlooking Lake Champlain. The population was 671 at the 2010 census. It looks lovely. Polaris was formed in 1997, quote, following a decade of social movement building in opposition to two major free trade agreements, end of quote. It is, quote, a left-leaning think tank, end of quote, from CBC News, New Brunswick, classified as a, quote, progressive, end of quote, think tank under the category of politics, government, judiciary, not, for example, under international, human rights, or even environment, resources, energy. So, it might seem that there are two main national lobby groups now. The Assembly of First Nations, AFN, run by chiefs, and the INM, run by, quote, grassroots, end of quote. But really, the INM website group is a subcontractor for a left-leaning, aka progressive, Ottawa political think tank. But bottom line, there is still the fact that Idle No More is not representable in that pure sense of being grassroots by some website, and any who choose to try to capitalize on the name. I am very happy to know that the two most consistent on matters of Indigenous nations of the four women who conceived Idle No More, Nina Wilson and Jessica Gordon, being Indigenous nationals who always respect the elders, not offending or ignoring them no matter who else is in the room, and continue to do everything they can to teach and be the excellent role models they are not involved in running this INM website. These Indigenous nationals are not compromised when it comes to Indigenous sovereignty. Who they are is clear. Who they hold in their hearts is clear. Who they cry tears for is clear. Who they are moved to act to protect is very clear. Clearly, they continue to inspire. They do not write manifestos. They manifest healthy Indigenous nationhood.